Welcome back to Our World and 18 Days in May of 1960. We had learned recently that cigarette smoking was at an all-time high in this country. The pill had just been approved as a safe oral contraceptive to be taken by prescription. We were hastening death and discouraging birth. Free will can be as confusing as trying to figure out the national purpose. Anyway, Elvis was back, Princess Margaret was married, Carol Chessman was dead, and the guy in the Kremlin was getting ready to drop the other shoe.
When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, he'd not drawn a natural breath for 5 hours. Artificial intake of oxygen gives a man a headache after a while, and the slightest wrinkle in this suit would pinch for hours. You need strength, you need patience. Powers had both. It would come in handy. Powers would pass the time in a Russian prison weaving these rugs, and they would hold together better than the fabric of lies woven by his government and unraveled by his very existence.
Thursday, May 5th, the Kremlin. Khrushchev opens a meeting of the Supreme Soviet with a long-winded speech. Newspaper reporter Priscilla Johnson.
Khrushchev began to speak, and I noticed that his voice was hoarse. After a little while, I heard shouts low in the hall, and to my right, there was an unmistakably ugly sound, and all I heard was shame, shame. And then I heard, shame to the aggressors.
The Soviets have shot down an American spy plane, Khrushchev says. It's a provocation, he says, coming so close to the summit conference. It's an insult, he says, coming on May Day. He says nothing about Francis Gary Powers. In Washington, the National Security Council is going through a prearranged doomsday test, rehearsing the move of government biggies to a secret location in the event of nuclear attack.
While we were there, we learned on the ticker that Khrushchev had announced that this plane had been shot down.
But Washington's cover story has not been shot down. Not yet.
We flew back to Washington at the end of this conference, and by the time we got back, of course, this was public, and Jim Haggerty, the press secretary, wanted to know from Eisenhower what could be said about it. He did not know about the U-2.
At noon, Haggerty still knows nothing, but he tells reporters that the space agency will have a statement. Trouble is, nobody has told NASA. NBC News White House correspondent Ray Shearer.
As soon as Haggerty finished his news conference, it was around noontime, I went over to NASA, which is just around the corner here, walked in the door and said, I've come for the statement. And they said, what statement? I said, the statement that Jim Haggerty said you're going to have. They said, we don't know anything about any statement. And I said, well, the White House said you're going to have a statement. And they were very puzzled, and they put some heads together. Finally, they brought out Walt Bonney, the head of public information for NASA, and he said he didn't know anything about any statement.
State Department spokesman Lincoln White does have a statement. It's the cover story, a bold, forthright, open lie.
The department has been informed by the NASA that, as announced May 3, an unarmed plane, a U-2 weather research plane based at Adana, Turkey, piloted by a civilian, has been missing since May 1. It is entirely possible that having a failure in the oxygen equipment.
By now, Walt Bonney over at the space agency has picked up the cue.
Now, if the pilot continued to suffer lack of oxygen, the path of the airplane from the last reported...
The statement goes into great detail about that U-2 weather plane. More borscht and baloney.
Saturday, May 7th, Moscow. Khrushchev springs the trap. Standing before the Supreme Soviet, he announces the news. Francis Gary Powers is alive, in Soviet custody, and cooperating.
General Goodpasture called me and he said, this is about as bad as it gets. Says they've got him alive.
The cover story was gone then, of course, and a cover story, of course, many of these things are based on what's called the doctrine of plausible denial, but there was no plausible denial left after Khrushchev said that he had the pilot, and indeed he did have the pilot.
6 p.m., Lincoln White can no longer hold the lies together.
Nevertheless, it appears that in endeavoring to obtain information now concealed behind the Iron Curtain, a flight over Soviet territory was probably undertaken by an unarmed civilian U-2 plane.
Probably the new truth is not the whole truth, but it's enough to blow the lid off the White House. America has admitted spying and lying. A real cover story, that is.
I have often walked down this street before.
On a street in Moscow, Soviet citizens bought tickets to an American production of My Fair Lady. People talked to Edward Mulhare, who played Professor Henry Higgins.
We opened 2 days after the U-2 was shut down. We had a wonderful time to start with, and everybody was very friendly. And the ordinary people continued to be friendly. But always at an official party, somebody would stand up and say something like, in spite of the fact that your country is sending planes over our country, thereby endangering world peace, we welcome you as artists.
Wednesday, May 11th, Moscow, the Chess Pavilion in Gorky Park. The wreckage of the U-2 on public display. Powers flight suit, survival equipment, photographs. Khrushchev takes reporters on a tour of the American lie. He is having a nice day. It's time for the president to talk. He says the responsibility is his, and that is telling the truth.
These activities have their own rules and methods of concealment, which seek to mislead and obscure.
Now, on that, we were all very clear that the moment the president himself said something, no one entertained any idea of it being other than the meticulous and complete truth.
Years later, another truth. He decided to stop lying, he said, when the lies stopped working.
When I saw what a terrible mess this lie had made of the thing, but it was a lie, of course, I just said, well, now look, here's the truth about the thing, and I did it, and that's that. When you get your fingers caught in the cookie jar, there's no use of pretending that you were out in the stable somewhere.
Sunday, May 15th, Orly Airport, Paris. Eisenhower, fingers fresh out of the cookie jar, has come to meet with Western leaders and Nikita Khrushchev. Maybe.
Well, the president is here. He hopes that once Khrushchev has his say, as expected, exploits the spy plane incident in his own particular way, that the big four leaders can have some of those informal private talks somewhere along the line, the sort of thing that Mr. Eisenhower likes so much.
Tuesday, May 17th. Eisenhower leaves. He, Macmillan, and de Gaulle have been waiting for hours, only to be informed that Khrushchev won't show up unless the president apologizes for spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower won't apologize for something he approved. The summit will end before it begins. Wednesday, May 18th, Palais de Chaillot, Paris. Again, Khrushchev gets to rant and rave as only he can. And feeling covered with glory by the whole wretched story. Across town, Eisenhower faces the truth of the consequences of the lies. There will be no summit, no promise of peace, no second chance, no glory. And that pretty much covers it.
That whole affair soured the final months of Ike's presidency. In West Virginia, early that month of May, 2 hungry Democrats were eager to take up the challenge of being president. Come back to our world and the West Virginia primary of 1960.
In a moment, Our World continues. Cover Stories, May 1960.
this enjoyment is brought to you by all the things sweetened with NutraSweet instead of sugar. Something you and your child can appreciate.
Would you like to have something sweet?
Just look for the swirl.
I like to go first class, so I appreciate Oldsmobile quality. That's the sporty Delta 88 Coupe. But with the foursome of my own, the Zeller car
Come on, kids.
is a Delta 88 sedan. Sporty enough for me.
But roomy enough for all of us.
Olds calls Delta 88 the family car that didn't forget the family.
And Fuzzy's family agrees.
Oldsmobile quality. Feel it.
When his stomach balks, Davy Johnson reaches for serious medicine. Rolaids consumes all the acid required to bring millions 100% relief. And relief is needed on days like these.
I should have gone into golf.
Get serious relief. Get Rolaids.
Do you believe it? My gums are receding. You know, you can get cavities where you never knew you had teeth, at the roots. I am going to use Listerment, because the fluoride in Listerment can penetrate the roots and help protect them. All this, and fresh breath, too.
Saturday, a knockout combination begins with ABC's Pro Bowlers Tour. The game's best compete for a piece of a $140,000 jackpot. Then on ABC's Wide World of Sports, Lloyd Hunnigan's incessant attack ripped the welterweight crown from Donald Curry. He then TKO'd Johnny Bumpus in his first title defense. Now he'll once again put his World Welterweight Championship on the line live. Plus, top 3-year-olds take off at the Wood Memorial Invitational. Catch the excitement on ABC Sports Saturday.
Welcome back to the 10th of May, 1960, primary day in West Virginia. A lot of Democrats wanted to be president. Senators Lyndon Johnson, Stuart Symington, Wayne Morse, and a whole flock of favorite sons. But they were waiting for lightning to strike. Senators Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy slugged it out in the primaries. Kennedy had been landing the most punches, but he still had not proved that a Catholic could be elected president. In West Virginia, 95% Protestant, with its coal miners and its poverty, JFK would be severely tested here. And here, Hubert Humphrey would make his final stand. Humphrey was an old-fashioned New Deal Democrat, and these were his people.
In a cavern down by a canyon, excavating for a mine, there lived a miner.
West Virginia was poor, hungry, and Protestant. And Hubert Humphrey, who had shown unexpected strength against the rich Catholic John F. Kennedy in Wisconsin a month before, was confident.
I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey, gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey, I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey, he's the man for you and me. He makes everybody happy, he makes everybody happy, he makes everybody happy.
Humphrey was a seasoned campaigner, but he was up against something here that, well, let Jimmy Wolford describe it. He wrote Humphrey's campaign song.
He's the man for you and me. The Kennedy organization, I don't know, it seemed to me as they were like Harvard, and the Humphrey organization in West Virginia was like a state-sponsored school. And the Kennedy people were like, not that the Humphrey people didn't have hip people. They did have hip people. They had knowledgeable people. They had good political pros with them and everything like that. But there was an entirely different breeze that came from the Kennedys. There was a different excitement. It was always like every day they wrote a new song.
Well, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. Jack jumped over the candlestick. He jumped so high up above, he landed in the cradle of love.
Kennedy poured money into the campaign, hopped from town to town in his own airplane. Humphrey rode the bus. West Virginia had the highest unemployment rate in the country, and Kennedy had his eyes opened. His press secretary was Pierre Salinger.
I think West Virginia had a prime effect on John Kennedy. It was in West Virginia that he discovered poverty. He went to visit coal mines, and there he saw people who were really hungry in America, people living in a state of life that he'd never seen before. And I think it deeply affected him.
Area redevelopment bill.
The candidates debated on television and pretty much agreed on the issues. Humphrey's campaign was broke, and this was about the only way he could get on television. His opponent had charm and a beautiful wife and the money to put them across.
Senator Kennedy can be our next president. It's up to you. Vote Kennedy for president, May 10th.
The following is a paid political telecast paid for by the West Virginians for Kennedy Committee. If you would like to ask the senator a question, just call the senator's attractive wife, Jacqueline, at Cedar 2-5980.
I supported the coal research bill, which the president vetoed.
I can say here that had the area redevelopment program been adopted,
Humphrey thought he was running a campaign against a rich kid, but the issue switched to Kennedy's religion. And now, to oppose Kennedy was to run the risk of being thought a bigot. Plenty ran the risk.
You would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were to be elected president.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president...
Kennedy realized this was a crucial time. No Catholic had ever been elected president, and it wasn't going to happen in 1960 if he couldn't get by the religion thing. He had to get them to accept or ignore his religion. But if he could do it in West Virginia, then he could do it. Kennedy's advisor, Ted Sorensen.
Kennedy decided to confront the religious issue directly in a speech to the American Society of Newspaper Editors that was delivered in Washington at the time of the West Virginia campaign.
I am not the Catholic candidate for the presidency. I do not speak for the Catholic Church on matters of public policy, and no one in the church speaks for me.
He decided to confront it directly in call-in television and radio shows in which he appeared inside of West Virginia.
As a Catholic, wouldn't the Pope or the bishop or priest be telling you what to do if you became president? Certainly not. No, the Pope, nor any bishop, nor any priest would attempt to tell me what to do in my public office, and if they did, I would have to say to him that I am going to maintain my oath of office.
Humphrey tried to avoid the religious question, but it didn't work out that way.
I'll never forget it as long as I live. A black lady, she was talking to Senator Humphrey, and they were into the civil rights thing, you know. And she was telling him what a wonderful man he was and everything. And he said, well, you know, I'm doing what I feel I have to do. And someone standing behind her said, you'll certainly win West Virginia because there ain't nobody going to vote for no Catholic. And Hubert Humphrey looked at him and he said, I don't want to become President of the United States because Jack Kennedy is a Catholic. And he pointed at him and he said, and I don't want your vote if you're voting for me because Jack Kennedy's a Catholic.
Still, it began to look like Humphrey would have the votes of more than one person in West Virginia who wasn't going to vote for no Catholic. Humphrey looked like the winner, Kennedy's own polls, and his campaign director, Larry O'Brien, said so.
How do you feel on Sunday? 48 hours, whatever it was before primary, when your own polls show you're going to lose. It was a dreary day. And we reflected the day, I guess. And we sat there. And I'll tell you, we were depressed. Primary day came. Again, as I recall, dreary weather, early rain. Our attitude hadn't changed very much. That night, precincts were reporting overwhelming Hubert lead. But that quickly turned, and the overwhelming leads by precinct started to turn to Kennedy. And it turned out to be probably the easiest election night I've ever experienced.
Humphrey headquarters in West Virginia. The state that was supposed to stop Kennedy had just given him 61% of the vote and stopped Hubert Humphrey instead.
We'd been out working all day, cold and rainy, and ice and snow, and I got in quite late that evening. And Senator Humphrey came in behind me with some of his Washington aides. And then he walked up very impromptu to a microphone. He started to make his little concession speech saying, it's over.
Now, I am no longer a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. I want to thank all of you, too. You've been very good people.
And I was standing there with the guitar. I wasn't really going to sing any songs or anything like that. Then all at once I looked at him and he looked at me. I thought I saw tears and I started. I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for Hubert Humphrey. I'm gonna vote for
Hubert Humphrey. He's the man for you and me. He'll make everybody happy. He'll make everybody happy.
Somewhere around the word happy, I looked in his eyes and he looked like he was crying, and I just broke down, started crying.
Hey, Jimmy.
And he came over to me and he said, oh, that's all right, Jimmy. Everything will be okay, Jimmy. He told me later, he said, you did my crying for me.
One story ends. One story ends happily.
I want tonight to express my thanks to the people of West Virginia for their fairness, their confidence, and for their support.
That night, it was clear to me that the people of West Virginia had determined the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. And as the dawn broke over West Virginia, and I didn't sleep, I concluded I could identify the next president of the United States.
Give Larry O'Brien an A in prophecy. Come back to the other legacies of our world, to some of the fine print that followed the cover stories of May 1960.
Buick presents an even better time to buy. Now you can get 3.9% APR financing or up to $1,200 cash back on selected new Buick models. Take your choice. Finance your new Buick at 3.9% APR or choose your new Buick with savings up to $1,200, depending on the amount of optional equipment you buy. See your participating Buick dealer right now for qualification details. It's an even better time to buy at Buick, where better really matters.
Since the 30s, dogs have loved Sturdy. It's oven-baked, not dried, for a unique, crunchy taste. Wheat flour, meat, and bone meal. Complete nutrition the old-fashioned way. Sturdy, the oven-baked dog food.
These cats don't realize the expensive-tasting dinners they're being served are Petuna gourmet cat food.
Tastes expensive.
But it isn't.
Maybe a little bite at my place?
Tasty fish, selected cuts of meat. Petuna. Tastes expensive, but it isn't.
Thursday, mercy killing or murder?
I think Malcolm is guilty of something.
You're gonna regret this, Mike. Jack and Mike. Then learn the secrets of success behind TV's toughest game show.
This is Jeopardy!
Don't miss 2020 After Jack and Mike, tonight.
There's fact, and then there's truth. For example, the calendar said it was the 60s, perhaps the biggest cover story of them all, because in spirit, it was still the 50s. Consider how that might have affected stories from 18 days in May and 1 day in April 1960. Because where you are in time spiritually changes where you go from there.
Don't want your love anymore.
Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones were divorced in 1978. Television coverage of subsequent royal weddings, live now by satellite, is up close and personal and head-on. And we could hear both Diana Spencer and Sarah Ferguson grapple with the names of their royal grooms.
Take thee, Charles Philip Arthur George.
Take thee, Philip Charles Arthur George.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
Take thee, Andrew Albert Christian Edward.
The order of the 4th Judicial District Court of the state of Utah has been carried out. Gary Mark Gilmore is dead.
Like Chessman and others. The protest have stopped nothing, but many states have replaced electric chairs and gas chambers with the lethal injection table and called it progress.
Do you plead guilty to the charges listed? Yes, I plead guilty.
Francis Gary Powers was convicted of spying by a Soviet court and sentenced to 10 years in prison. In 1962, he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy, in Berlin. Powers, who became a TV helicopter reporter in Los Angeles and died in a crash in 1977, will be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously next fall. After the summit conference failed, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge accused the Soviets of bugging our embassy in Moscow. This year, the Soviets have apparently bugged the new American embassy as it was being built, and they say that their buildings in this country are nests of bugs.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Cover stories are still coming apart, and presidents are still taking the rap when they have run out of options.
Let me say first that I accept the nomination of the Democratic Party.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy would be the cover story of the year, and Jimmy Wolford would cover his bets. Words were easier to change than tunes anyway.
I'm gonna vote for John Kennedy. Gonna vote for John Kennedy. I'm gonna vote for John Kennedy. He's the man for you and me.
Well, there it is the way it was in May of 1960. During that period, an American defector named Lee Harvey Oswald was working in a radio and TV factory in Minsk. Oswald became as disenchanted with the Soviet Union as he was with the United States, came back to this country, and on a November day in 1963, snuffed out John Kennedy's life and Camelot, and maybe our national purpose. Kennedy began the Peace Corps, prodded us toward the moon, aroused our conscience on civil rights. That probably didn't add up to a national purpose, but it gave us something to look forward to besides microwave popcorn or a new Toyota.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Historian Will Durant wrote that civilization is a stream with banks. A stream filled with people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing things historians record, while on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, even write poetry. He said the story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks. I offer, as proof he's right, my favorite play, a little seemingly unimportant thing called The Fantastics. Barely a story, much less a cover story when it opened that May of 1960. But while Eisenhower, Khrushchev, Powers, Presley, Kennedy, Humphrey, the 60s, the 70s, and more than half the 80s are long gone, The Fantastics is still around, still at the Sullivan Street Playhouse, 27 years, May 1987, the longest running play in America. But then The Fantastics is about what happens on the banks. It's nice to remember. And so it goes. Also during that 18 days in May and 1 day in April 1960,
the U.S. nuclear submarine Triton completed an underwater trip around the world. It took 84 days.
The Soviet Union launched a 5-ton space satellite with a dummy cosmonaut aboard.
Lunch counters at 6 department stores and variety stores in Nashville were desegregated after 3 months of sit-in demonstrations and boycotts.
Philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, Jr. died. In his lifetime, he had given away $475 million.
Prince Ali Khan, playboy and diplomat, was killed in an auto accident near Paris. He was 48.
The average price of an appendectomy in Cleveland was $137.50.
For a transcript of this broadcast, send $3 to Our World Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038.
For the Our World Viewer Guide, write to Community Relations, ABC, 1330 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10019.